Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. This is Kevin Peckham. I'm your moderator for our very timely topic today. We're going to be talking about the ongoing UHF spectrum auction. And we have a very capable guide through this rather involved multi-step UHF auction that's going on. We're going to try and present this in a way that you come away with an understanding of the changes and implications that this will have for wireless microphone users in the U.S. So our presenter today comes from Shure. Gino Sigismondi is a presenter. He is the manager of technical training for Shure. And he is really on the front lines, as Shure is in this ongoing spectrum reassignment process. But also, Gino is an active musician, so he has a stake in this as an end user. He's a guitar player and sound engineer, and so he has a very personal interest in this, as we all do. So before we turn things over to Gino, a couple of housekeeping points. We're going to have you send your questions to me. I'll hold them until the end, so please make use of the question feature to ask your questions. I will collect those and consolidate them. I suspect we may get multiple questions on a similar topic, so I'll try and bring those together and present those to Gino at the end of the formal presentation, so we cover that material. Also, please make note that this is a presentation that's being recorded, so it can be made available to some of your coworkers if you're interested to do so at a later time. And we also ask that you complete the survey that is going to help us make better seminars in the future. So with that, Gino, if you're standing by south of the border down there in, and by the way, go Cubs as we transition to Gino down in Illinois. Gino, smile and tell us how happy you are about the Cubs, and then we'll get on with our presentation.
Oh, well, I'll be happier if the Cubs win tonight. Last night was not exactly the prettiest thing I've ever seen in this particular season here. But yeah, hello to everyone on the webinar. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for that nice introduction, Kevin, and to FGW for having me on here. This is a topic that we talk about a lot over here at Shure, as you can imagine. You know, wireless audio, wireless microphones, a big part of our business, and you know, we in my area in particular, we spend a lot of time helping people choose wireless systems, use wireless systems, troubleshoot wireless systems, and this is a topic that comes up quite often. And there's, as there has been over the years of all of this stuff, quite a bit of misinformation out there. So hopefully what we can do here in the next 45 minutes or so is give as much clarity as we can to the situation. You know, it's not always the most straightforward thing, as with many government regulatory issues, but I think we can at least give you an idea of what's going on and maybe how best to prepare for that. So, let's see, do I have control of the slides here yet? Let's see if I can advance the slide here. Does not seem to be letting me do so. Let's see. I'm going to request keyboard and mouse control. Let's see if I can get it that way. Ah, there we go. Okay, here we go. All right, spectrum update. All right, so here's what we're going to cover here. Again, we're going to talk a little bit about why this is happening, because a lot of people get confused about what's even going on here. We'll give you an update on the white space devices, which is, it's a term that'll mean something to some of you, and if it doesn't, we'll clarify what that means, and then really get to the heart of the matter, which is the current proceeding, which is what's known as an incentive auction, and some related issues referring to related to wireless microphone licensing, and as well as new spectrum opportunities that might become available for wireless microphone users. So first of all, you know, why is this happening? Well, you have to look at the big picture here. Wireless microphones are certainly an important thing to those of us who use them, and to the people who are the recipients of the content that those of us who use wireless audio systems create, right? It's an important thing. But let's take a look at where the real wireless growth is in this country, and that is in mobile data. Everyone's running around with something in their pocket that they can use for connecting to data services. And you can see here how much that data rate, the growth rate has been just since 2013. It's up 81%. In fact, these numbers are getting a little old here too. I probably need to update these. It's probably even beyond that now. The one that that always gets me the most is that in 2013, mobile data usage was 18 times the total amount of internet data in 2000. That's just for mobile data, 18 times more. It's kind of ridiculous. There's more mobile devices than there are people in the world as of 2014. So the U.S. government is trying to find as many ways as they can to find more spectrum for all of this stuff. The more devices that want to be wireless and that need wireless data, the more spectrum you need in order to accomplish that. So this particular slide is always a good place to start, because what it shows you is how the FCC has already allocated the entire usable radio spectrum for a variety of different purposes. There really is just no spectrum left, is kind of the point of even showing this. It's already all been allocated for something. So what the FCC has to do is try and find ways to optimize the spectrum that's already there to accommodate more services. And it turns out that the spectrum where UHF wireless microphones operate is kind of considered beachfront property, because as you saw there, when you go lower in frequency, antenna wavelengths get longer. Wavelength and antenna length corresponds directly to the wavelength of the frequency that we're interested in, and so lower frequencies, longer wavelengths, longer antennas. It's pretty much unmanageable for personal handheld devices. And as you go higher in frequency, you start running into issues with path loss and loss to the air and obstruction by solid objects, and just the transmission characteristics aren't as good. So the area of spectrum between 300 megahertz and 3 gigahertz is where most of this usage is concentrated, and the red circled area there is the UHF television band where UHF wireless microphones operate. Again, this is considered beachfront property, and to a certain extent was considered underutilized spectrum. If you could point to any part of the spectrum and find maybe something that was unused, you might look in the UHF television band, where not every particular frequency is occupied by a TV channel, and there was some thought that, well, maybe we can optimize this a little bit better. To take a more granular look at this from a different perspective, though, is only 15% of people actually watch television with an antenna, right? A lot of people don't even know that you can get free TV with an antenna still. It turns out you don't actually have to pay for cable, believe it or not. You could put an antenna on your roof and go watch TV for free. But most people don't, 15% of the population only, versus 64% of the population that own a smartphone. So if you're the FCC trying to look at optimizing usage of spectrum, what seems like a better use of the UHF television band? A free television service that most people don't look at, or data for cell phones, which most people have? The first kind of reallocation of the UHF television spectrum began back in 1997. That's when the FCC began the process of transitioning to digital television broadcasting in the U.S. instead of analog television broadcasting. And one of the great things about DTV broadcasting is that it's more spectrally efficient than UHF television broadcasting is. So that means that you can pack more TV channels into a smaller amount of spectrum. And by doing that, the FCC was then able to do the first auction, which some of us remember and lived through, which was the 700 megahertz auction. And at that time, everything from 698 megahertz up to 806 megahertz was auctioned off to the highest bidder, mostly telecoms like AT&T and Verizon, and Qualcomm, who ended up selling their spectrum back or selling it to AT&T. And some of that was also reallocated for public safety, but the spectrum brought in $19.6 billion. So whenever people would ask us, well, how come Shure doesn't go buy some spectrum? Well, this is why. It's a little bit out of our price range here. But that process, you notice, dragged on from 1997 to 2008. So these things often take a while to really get going. It was supposed to end by the end of 2006, and it took over a year longer to actually get it all done. But during this process, of this auctioning of 700 megahertz, the FCC also started what they called the white space proceeding. And the idea here was that in any given television market, not every TV channel is used, not every frequency is used for broadcasting. Even after the 700 megahertz auction, there was going to be some quote-unquote leftover unused spectrum. Well, this is the same spectrum that wireless mics use, right? That's how we find a clear channel, is we tune into those open spaces or white spaces in between TV channels. The white spaces idea here was that the spectrum would, the unused or underutilized white space spectrum would also be available to unlicensed devices for whatever wireless purpose they needed. There was a lot of companies like Google and Microsoft, Intel were very into this idea of, rather than selling off that spectrum, let's open it up on an unlicensed basis for everyone. Well, Shure and many other people in the wireless community got very involved in making sure that rules were put in place that would make sure that there was still some spectrum left over for wireless microphones, because it is an important public service. And that is still going on. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But in June of 2010 was when the DTV transition was actually completed. So even though the 700 megahertz auction ended in January 2008, which was already behind schedule, it took until June of 2010 before analog TV finally switched off and the digital television transition was completed. Fast forward to May of 2014, and the FCC introduces another report and order for something that's called the incentive auction, because it turns out that the 700 megahertz auctions and several other auctions in other parts of the spectrum weren't enough, and we need to get some more back from the UHF broadcasters. We'll get to that in a minute. Just to sum up, again, kind of what's going on with the white space devices. Again, this graphic kind of helps you see how in a sample television market, a certain number of frequencies are occupied by DTV channels, represented by the blue bars, and then in between the white bars is the white space or unused spectrum, which is, of course, where we would use wireless microphone systems. And again, the idea here was that you could open this up for anyone to make unlicensed devices that could use that spectrum. Those devices actually are authorized to operate nationwide. Unfortunately, they don't really exist. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. Fortunately, they don't exist. Fortunately for us, because those kinds of things would cause problems for wireless microphones because they're unpredictable sources of interference. But largely, I think, due to the uncertainty caused by this incentive auction, there has not been a rush to create devices that can actually operate in the white spaces, things that would be known as TV band devices. So except for a couple of small test networks using fixed devices, there's really nobody out there even using that service, which is okay. But it's still something we need to keep in mind. One of the concessions that we got as for professional wireless mic users was the ability to register channels for your event, for your wireless microphones, to prevent these white space devices from interfering with you. And there are several different database providers out there where they are active today. I'll show you them in a minute here, where you can go in and actually enter your address, and it will show you which TV channels are occupied, which ones are open, which ones are available for wireless mics, and then allow you, for specific dates and times at specific locations, register channels so that these white space devices, if and when they ever exist, can't interfere with you. An important nuance that developed recently, though, is that once this latest auction is done, this ability would be limited to licensed wireless microphone users. And we're going to talk more about licensing in a little bit, so if you're wondering what that means or how do you get licensed, we'll get there. But it's important to understand that this ability to register channels for your usage in the database does require a license. Here are the databases that are currently active. There's supposed to be 9 or 10 total eventually, but these were kind of the first ones out of the gate. You can go to any one of these websites, or you could just search for Spectrum Bridge, iConnective, which used to be known as Telcordia, KeyBridge, and of course Google. If there's a database involved, Google gets involved, right? So Google has their own Spectrum database as well. And any of these can be used to search for what TV channels are available, and any of these can be used to register your frequencies. It doesn't matter which one you use, they all have to talk to each other, so you just pick the one that you like best. And there's no cost to the wireless mic user to do this, so it's a nice advantage, maybe in the future. Again, there's no reason to have to worry about this today. Nothing's changed. But in the future, if Spectrum does get more crowded, having the ability to register channels for yourself is actually pretty powerful. This is just a screen capture from the iConnective database. The kind of cool thing about this one is it actually shows you on a map the actual coverage of the television broadcast. So for all these different TV channels that are on the air, this is their actual antenna coverage patterns. So sometimes it allows you to see, like, if you're just outside those circles, it's the best way to know whether or not a particular TV channel might cause a problem for you or not. So it's kind of a useful thing. But at any rate, that's all the history. That's kind of where we've been. We survived the DTV transition and the 700 megahertz auction, and the white spaces thing turned out to be mostly a non-issue, at least up until this point. But now it's another auction? Thought we just did this. Well, here's what happened. As I mentioned, the need for mobile data, for spectrum for mobile data, is growing because so many people use mobile data all the time. So an action that was taken in 2012 was Congress passed the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012, and there were several things that were part of that act that affect spectrum. And one of the goals that was laid out in that act was to find more spectrum for mobile broadband, to get money from the sale of that spectrum to help fund a nationwide public safety network, which still does not exist despite being talked about for many years. And if there's any money left over, go ahead and put it in the Treasury. So that was kind of some of the goals that were laid out in a congressional act. So the FCC is doing this because of a congressional act. It's not because they're picking on wireless microphone users and they don't like us and they want to kick us out and get us off the air. There was the requirement that this has to happen. So the tactic that the FCC is employing is what's called an incentive auction for the television broadcasters. What the heck is an incentive auction, right? Well, this is different from the 700 megahertz auction. The 700 megahertz auction was basically the FCC took that spectrum away from the broadcasters, kicked them out, and sold it and kept all the money. Maybe because that would look bad from a PR perspective to go ahead and do that again, or who knows what other reasons, they decided to soften the tactic this time by allowing broadcasters to voluntarily participate in the incentive auction, with the carrot being you can share in some of the proceeds that are generated by this. Seems like, kind of a cool thing, because that way they're not being bad guys and taking the spectrum away. They're saying, look, we know it's inconvenient to have to move again, so we will help you make some money by giving up your television channel. How is this going to work? Well, there's three kind of major phases to the whole procedure. And the first two phases actually can be carried out multiple times over until the spectrum auction is complete, and that's sort of what we're dealing with right now. You have the first phase is what we call a reverse auction. A reverse auction is where the TV channels basically agree to participate in the auction and throw out a figure for how much money they want. And then the forward auction is where the carriers, the mobile carriers or whoever wants to buy the spectrum, swoop in and say, all right, well, this is how much money we are willing to spend to buy that spectrum. And the auction can go through multiple stages, because if these two numbers don't line up, if for X amount of spectrum the broadcasters want X amount of dollars, and the amount of money that the carriers are willing to put up in the forward auction, if those two things don't line up, then we do it all over again for a smaller amount of spectrum. So each time we go through one of these stages, the amount of spectrum that's up for auction will vary. The broadcasters themselves really have a few options for what they do when they participate in the auction. One option, which gets you the most money, the highest percentage of the share there, is to just go off the air completely. Just get out of the broadcast business, let your channel go dark, and away you go. Another option is to share with another TV broadcaster. If you're not aware, one of the cool things you can do with DTV is send out multiple signals or multiple sub-channels of programming on a single 6 megahertz TV channel. So for any of you who may watch over-the-air DTV, I do, you can actually find that there's sub-channels. So you tune to channel 7, which would be maybe the primary, like in Chicago, that's the ABC affiliate, right? So it's a major channel, and 7-1 is basically that ABC programming. But then there's sub-channels, 7-2, 7-3, 7-4, but they're all kind of owned by the local channel 7 in Chicago. But what if two channels decided to just share their programming on the sub-channels of a single DTV carrier? You could do that. So that's another option. The third option is to move down to the VHF television band. So the goal here really is to clear out as much UHF spectrum as we can for this auction, mostly starting up near the 600 megahertz band. So one way to get people out of UHF is to move them down to VHF. And there's two different VHF bands for, again, those of us that remember these things. There's high band VHF, which is TV channels 7 through 13, and low band VHF, which is TV channels 2 through 6. And you get the most money between those two options to going to low band VHF because it actually has the worst propagation characteristics for DTV, but they'd rather get you lower, and then you get a little bit less money if you go to the high band VHF. What you don't get any money for is moving to a lower UHF channel. That's the most important thing that you have to keep in mind, is that moving to lower UHF doesn't get the broadcasters anything. So all of that aside, once all of these stages are complete, then we go into the repacking phase. And the repacking phase is where the FCC now has to help all of these broadcasters move around and be reallocated and get out of the spectrum that's sold during auction. And that could take quite a while. So we still don't know yet, until these stages are complete, exactly how much spectrum is going to be sold. Which spectrum, again, it's going to be somewhere in the 600 megahertz band, but it could go lower depending on how much actually gets auctioned. When, we can talk a little bit about more of that, since we're in the middle of the auction now, we actually have a little bit better idea of the timing. So here's the stages that we're at right now. Excuse me, I had a little cough. I'm going to take a sip of water here. Okay. On June 29th, the Stage 1 reverse auction was complete. And at that time, the FCC announced that they would have 126 megahertz of spectrum available to be put up for auction in the forward stage of the auction. And the amount of money that the broadcasters wanted for that 126 megahertz, $86 billion. Everyone over here was falling out of our chairs when we saw that. That is a lot of money, which we thought, hey, this is great because this means they probably won't ever be able to sell all of that 126 megahertz, because that's a lot. I mean, that takes you clear down to TV channel, what did we say it was? I believe TV channel 27 or something like that, 28. I mean, it's way down into the 500 megahertz band. It's a lot of spectrum. And as expected, that didn't go through. On August 20th, the FCC stopped the forward auction because after going for about a month, it had only generated $23 billion, far less than the $86 billion that was needed to call that a successful auction. So they stopped it and started over another stage where they dropped the target to 114 megahertz. That started on September 13th. And when that, ended on September 13th. So when the Stage 2 reverse auction was done, for a little bit less spectrum, it dropped all the way to $54.5 billion. Here's where things get weird. On October 19th, the FCC started and ended the Stage 2 forward auction. I guess at that point what happened was that it very quickly got to $21.5 billion, and in the majority of the television markets where the auction was occurring, there was only one bidder for each allocation of spectrum, which meant that with only one bidder for each chunk, there was nobody else to outbid any of them, so it was obvious that it was never going to go any higher. So Stage 2 forward auction begins and ends on the same day, still below the goal of what it needed to be. So we go to Stage 3. So now I'm sorry, I have a typo in there. That should actually be, I believe it drops to 108 megahertz now, not 114. I apologize for that typo. In the Stage 3 reverse auction, they will try, try and auction 108 megahertz, and we will see how much that does. And then when that goes through, and that's complete, we'll go through another forward auction and see if the two will meet. And this just keeps continuing. But at this point, it looks like the auction phase won't be completed until sometime in 2017, which is, hey, that's great, because the longer it takes, the longer it takes. Let's look at what some possible auction outcomes are, and this information we kind of created here, started sharing back before we knew how much they were actually going to go for. But if you look in the middle, you can see scenario number 10 was when they were looking at auctioning off 126 megahertz. So yeah, that would have went all the way down to TV channel 29. We would have lost everything up above that, all the way up to TV channel 51. But now we've dropped to 114 megahertz and then down to 108 megahertz. So the number 8 there is the phase that we're going in, which is actually, if that succeeds, is not so bad, and here's why. Let's zoom in a little bit on what some of these gray areas in the spectrum chart mean. The blue boxes represent paired bands that are being auctioned. They are 5 megahertz bands that are sold in pairs, like the A pair, the B pair, the C pair, because when you're providing mobile data, you have an uplink and a downlink band, right? Uplink, you're transmitting data away from the phone, and downlink, you're receiving data into the phone. So it's always a two-way communication there. So there's paired bands, and in between those paired bands, to prevent the uplink and the downlink from interfering with one another, there's what's called the duplex gap, which is basically like a guard band in between the uplink and downlink band. So that's what that 11 megahertz chunk represents. There's also several guard bands that might come into play depending on how much spectrum ends up getting auctioned. And those guard bands there are there to protect the mobile service from interference with TV broadcasts, et cetera, et cetera. So on the bottom row there, you'll notice there's a 7 megahertz guard band that separates the auctioned A band from TV channel 31. And then there's 3 megahertz bands around TV channel 37. Now, for those of you who don't know, TV channel 37 is reserved for medical telemetry and radio astronomy. It's actually not used for broadcast. And so in order to protect that spectrum, we have these 3 megahertz guard bands on either side of TV channel 37. The reason this is important is because wireless microphone users will have access to the duplex gap and the guard bands and won't have to worry about interference from these new services or TV there. That's kind of a big deal that they actually gave us that spectrum. And the reason that we like the oops, went too far. The reason that we like option number 8 for 108 megahertz is if you look at there, we pick up an 11 megahertz guard band up above TV channel 32, in addition to the 3 megahertz guard bands on the either side of TV channel 37 and the 11 megahertz duplex gap. The reason that number varies is because TV broadcasts are on a 6 megahertz grid, and the auction spectrum is on a 5 megahertz grid. So depending on how much spectrum gets auctioned when those paired bands are let go, there's always going to be a remainder against the 6 megahertz TV grid, so that remainder varies depending on where you line up in the spectrum there. So so that 108 megahertz, we actually kind of like that option, because if you notice the next blob where it drops down to 84 megahertz if this stage fails, we only get one 3 megahertz guard band on the upside of TV 37 and that 11 megahertz duplex gap. So, you know, I mean, we'll take what we can get, and maybe that does leave more spectrum that's freed up, but there might be TV channels there. So in some ways, that we might kind of hope that stage 3 actually goes through here. To take to zoom in a little bit further, just to get a closer look at how those bands are going to work. The duplex gap is divided into 2 sections, a 4 megahertz band that is only available to licensed wireless mic users, another good reason to get a license, which we're going to talk about in a minute here, and 6 megahertz of spectrum for unlicensed, meaning any wireless mic users, but also means shared with white space devices, which, as we talked about, don't exist yet and may or may not ever come, but if they do, they would have access to that shared part of the spectrum. The other guard bands are also utilized by both wireless microphones and the unlicensed white space devices. But there's even a little further nuance around there. If we zoom in and look at what those 3 megahertz guard bands on either side of TV channel 37 look at, the white space devices are required to give a wider berth to TV channel 37 than microphones have to. So that means that out of that 3 megahertz on either side of TV channel 37, 2 megahertz on either side will only be available to wireless microphones. So that's 4 megahertz of total spectrum, in addition to the 4 megahertz in the duplex gap, that are available only to wireless mics. Again, that doesn't sound like a lot, but to have any spectrum that is only for wireless mics and nobody else, no TV broadcasts, no white space devices, no mobile devices, nobody else can use that spectrum, that's a nice thing to have, and we'll certainly take it if we can get it. So all of this, again, is to illustrate something which gets lost in a lot of this, which is that just because there's a 600 megahertz auction happening, as people call it, we may not lose all of it. There still will be some pockets of spectrum there for wireless microphones to be able to use, in addition to the unused TV channels that may be left over after the auction is complete and everything has moved around. So I think we kind of talked through this already here. Yeah, we went through these different stages. So the next question is, well, what happens when these stages are complete. Let's say stage 3 is complete and goes forward, and everybody's happy and the auction goes through, is a success. Well, the next phase then is the repacking phase. The repacking phase is currently slated to take as much as 39 months to complete. That's over 3 years, because it's quite a feat to now once again move around a bunch of TV channels. Antenna crews need to be engaged, of which there's a limited number of. New equipment needs to be purchased, new transmitters. It's an undertaking. At any point during that transition, if a broadcaster goes off the air and that spectrum is vacated, then the winner of that auction spectrum can start using it. And this may be happening on kind of a market-by-market or band-by-band basis throughout that spectrum. So the thing you need to understand about the 39-month deadline is that that is a hard stop where everything has to be done by that point. So it's not like, we can assume that there won't be any new services happening during that entire 39 months. They could come online sooner depending on when those broadcasters move out. But by the end of that 39 month, that's when the whole shoot match has to be ended. So, if we put that, let's say the auction actually ends in January or towards the end of December of this year, it'll be at least probably 2 to 3 months before the FCC publishes their table of allocations that actually shows what the results are and where everybody's being moved. So that puts us in March or so, and that point is when the 39th month starts ticking. All of this is to say that if you have wireless microphones in 600 megahertz right now, there is absolutely no reason to stop using them. None of this is going to affect you for probably, let's say things go swimmingly well, probably another year at the soonest. At some point, when this auction is complete, depending on how much auction spectrum actually gets sold and when they start the clock ticking, you will probably need to think about replacing that equipment, but there's no reason to stop right now. Let's talk about licensing now. So some of you may not be aware that up until January of 2009, it was actually required to have a license from the FCC, a Part 74 broadcast license, to operate a wireless microphone in this country. Most people didn't know that. Most people didn't have licenses. And you know what? It was never really a problem. So that's why the FCC never really did anything about it. But they did, in the middle of the white space proceeding, have to kind of confront the issue of all these wireless mics out there that didn't have a license. And what they did was they created a new tier of unlicensed wireless microphone users, essentially giving blanket amnesty to everyone that has a wireless microphone without a license, and said, great, go ahead, keep using it on an unlicensed basis. You're on equal footing with the white space TV band devices, which don't exist, but that's kind of the lowest tier. That's considered the bottom feeder of the licensing spectrum in the UHF television band. So the secondary users, licensed wireless mic users, that class still exists, and you can still get a license if you want to for your wireless microphone. And then, of course, the broadcasters, the TV stations, are the primary user of the spectrum. So this had some implications, and the FCC issued a second report in order to give us some further guidance and clarity on what all of this licensing means for wireless microphones, because Shure in particular was an advocate of expanding who is eligible for a license. And we'll see how they've expanded that in a second here. So the second report in order expanded license eligibility for wireless microphones, allowed the continued unlicensed operation of wireless microphones, and committed to a search for more spectrum for wireless microphones. Realizing that we're being squeezed here in UHF, yet the demand for wireless mics continues to go up, we are actively working with the FCC to try and find other homes for wireless mics in other parts of the spectrum so that there will continue to be good usable spectrum for wireless mic users. Getting a little bit into the weeds here, but this is kind of a cool thing. I'll just read it. Co-channel operation allowed if indoor received signal strength is less than 85 dBm. What in the world does that mean? That means that if you go to the Shure website, Frequency Finder, and you look up what television broadcasts are in your area, and there's a lot of TV channels, and you're having a hard time finding an open channel for you to use, if you're indoors and your spectrum analyzer, because everybody has a spectrum analyzer, your spectrum analyzer shows you that that TV channel that's supposedly on the air in your city is actually only being received at less than 85 dBm, then that's actually okay to use a wireless mic on that channel. In other words, you're far enough away from that signal, or that signal is so weak from that TV transmitter that it's okay to operate wireless microphones, quote-unquote, co-channel on that. This opens up a lot of additional spectrum potentially for indoor usage, because buildings attenuate the radio signal quite a bit, and so now it is essentially the FCC legalizing the co-channel operation between DTV and wireless microphones. And this is a practice that high-end RF coordinators have been doing for a long time, but it just kind of gets officially codified here. Kind of a neat sort of a thing. Talking about licensing eligibility again, prior to this recent action by the FCC, the only people that were actually able to get a license for their wireless microphones were the entities you see here, primarily broadcasters. If you wanted to get a license from the FCC and you applied, you couldn't just be any old person applying for it. You actually had to be one of these types of institutions. What's changed now is that anyone, venues, sound companies, whatever, that regularly uses 50 or more channels of audio, of wireless audio on a regular basis, is now eligible for a license. The broadcasters and those people who were previously eligible, it doesn't matter how many wireless mics you're using, they can do whatever they want. But for anybody else, which includes, and it's not limited to, but just includes some of the users shown here, you are now also eligible for a license. Now 50 sounds like a lot, but if you consider some of the larger house of worship campuses and how many wireless mics a university might have on campus, and if you start including wireless in-ear monitor systems and wireless comm systems and all of those other things, you can actually very quickly get up to 50 channels. And the sound companies can also get licensed. If you're a sound company that regularly provides more than 50 wireless mics for events, you can be licensed and then extend that license to the client that is renting the equipment from you, because you're the licensed provider in that scenario. And the rules are somewhat loose as far as like how you prove this. There's not a lot of clarity on that. And what is the FCC considered a regular basis? Once a week, every day, once a month? There's a lot of gray area there. So what I'm saying is that if you're interested in getting a license and you think you might qualify, the best thing to do is engage a law firm that specializes in communications law, or a company like, there's a company in Florida called Professional Wireless Systems who provides wireless for a lot of high-end stuff. They have a service. You can pay them to help you with the license application. And I would highly recommend it. The application is arcane, and whether or not you actually get approved for the license depends a lot on how you fill it out. So seek professional help if you're interested in doing this, because having a license is probably going to be a good thing going forward. Again, as we talked about earlier, you will get that ability to register for protected channels in the television band, which if these white space devices ever come around is a useful thing. That's probably the biggest single reason to get a license. It actually can transmit at higher power. If you have a wireless that can transmit at 250 milliwatts, you're allowed. Unlicensed users are not supposed to transmit at more than 50 milliwatts. Don't ask me how they police this, but that's just what the rules are. And thirdly, which we're going to talk about next, is a lot of the opportunities outside of the TV bands that we're looking at for future wireless microphones are designed to accommodate these higher-end licensed users. So if you are someone who uses a lot of wireless and you get a license, you're going to have more opportunities in these other parts of the spectrum in order to do that. So something the FCC committed to with a further proceeding here is a docket here, spectrum access for wireless microphone operations. This is the FCC's action to begin the process of looking for other spectrum opportunities that might be useful for wireless microphones. Right now, actually, this isn't even part of this action, because this actually exists now. For unlicensed users, there are plenty of places you can already go. Many manufacturers, Shure included, have wireless microphones that operate at 900 megahertz and 2.4 gigahertz unlicensed bands, which it has its own set of challenges because it's unlicensed. That means everybody can use it. If you're in 2.4, you're dealing with Wi-Fi, right? And you have to learn how to get around that. So there's that. But those bands are available. Products do exist. The in the U.S., what we call the PCS band or the DECT band, 1920 to 1930, is available. Again, it's a little bit more specialized for particular applications, but it's there. And back to VHF. You old timers like me that have been around this business for a while remember when that's all you could buy was VHF wireless microphones, and then we started moving to UHF when it appeared that there was a lot more open spectrum up there, which there was, and we did such a great job of convincing everyone that UHF was better that you couldn't sell a VHF wireless, and they went away. But there is still good usable spectrum down there, and really our philosophy these days is any spectrum is good spectrum. So if we can find some channels to use in VHF, by all means use them. And we are on the cusp of shipping VHF versions of our ULXD and QLXD products very soon to take advantage of exactly that. For licensed users, there's a couple of things happening. One of the most significant is that there is a frequency band known as the STL band, which stands for Studio Transmitter Link, which goes 944 to 952 megahertz. And this was reserved for broadcasters only to use. We refer to it as the X band, like we have some free products in the X1 band that operate up there. Well, the FCC has now decided to expand eligibility so that all licensed users, not just broadcasters, can use that band, and they're making it bigger. It's going to go from 941 to 960 megahertz. So you're going to have a 19 megahertz band there that you can use for these purposes, which is really great for those licensed users. And then we're investigating some other spectrum, which nothing's really happened here yet. There's more trade-offs in some of these higher frequency bands, but there's definite interest in getting some of these open and available for licensed users. So stay tuned for more on that. So to kind of sum it up here, what do we know? Well, we do know that spectrum below 600 megahertz is going to get more crowded. We're losing spectrum. Some broadcasters are going to go off the air, but some aren't, and those that aren't are going to be repacked lower. So spectrum is going to get more crowded, which means frequency coordination and scanning and all of that become important to make sure you're on clear channel. But some spectrum will still be available below 600 megahertz. We know that there will be some channels available in addition to those guard bands and the duplex gap that we talked about. And licensed users will still be able to reserve open TV channels post-auction. More wireless mic users can apply for Part 74 licensing. As I said, get help if you're thinking of doing that, but if you use a lot of wireless, it is a possibility. During the transition, so once the auction is complete and the table of allocations is out and that clock starts ticking on that 39-month transition, as I said, at any point in there in that 39-month transition, these new services will come on the air, and those channels that they bought will become off limits. How do you know? You can check the official databases, which will always be up to date with the most current information. And in fact, you don't even have to go to any Keybridge or Spectrum Bridge or any of those other ones. You can go right to the Shure website, because the frequency finder information on Shure.com's frequency finder is pulled directly from Keybridge. So as their information gets up to date during the transition, our information will be up to date as well, and you'll be able to stay on top of that. Worst case scenario is you'll start getting interference, and that will be your clue that, well, I guess the spectrum isn't usable anymore, but better to stay on top of it instead of being behind it. What we don't know is exactly how much spectrum is going to be auctioned. Again, right now we're at 108. We'll see how that goes. It could be less, and we're still in this kind of search for new spectrum, and there will be more details to come on that. What should you do? Number one, don't panic. We've lived through this before. We'll live through it again. Wireless mics aren't going anywhere. There will be things in place to help our users through this, so don't worry about that. So if you're currently using 600 megahertz wireless, as I said, you don't have to do anything right now. You can keep using it. It's totally fine. Consult the databases once the auction is complete to find out how much longer you can keep using it, but you're okay for now. The larger question, the more complicated question is what to do when you're purchasing new wireless systems, right? Obviously, given everything we know now, you probably want to stay out of the 600 megahertz band. If the 108 megahertz scenario goes through, that takes us down to about TV channel 32, which is 584 megahertz. So any new wireless you buy, you might want to stay out of that spectrum. Maybe that'll even be fine, who knows. But that's kind of where it stands for now. Since the spectrum that's going to be left over after the auction is going to be more crowded, the most important thing you can look for when you're choosing a new wireless microphone is how spectrally efficient it is. And by spectrally efficient, that means how close together can you pack the frequencies? Or another way to look at it, how many wireless mic frequencies can you pack into a single 6 megahertz TV channel? And there have been great strides made in the industry recently in terms of how spectrally efficient we've gotten. For a comparison's sake, Shure's ULX analog, which came out in 2002, you could use maybe 6 wireless mics in a single 6 megahertz TV channel. ULXD, the digital version, and QLXD can do 17 in a single 6 megahertz TV channel. So this is where you get what you pay for starts to become really important, because these newer a lot of these and digital wireless microphone systems are much more spectrally efficient, but that's really the most critical parameter you can look at, as well as something with the widest possible tuning range, right? I mean, if you're traveling around a lot, especially the TV channels, the spectrum that is going to be open is going to vary. So you might want to have a system that has a wide tuning range so that you can always tune it to where those open frequencies are. So wide tuning range, high spectral efficiency, that's the important things to look for in a new wireless. Or consider getting out of UHF altogether. As I mentioned, we've got VHF versions of stuff coming out. There's 900 megahertz wireless. There's 2.4 gigahertz wireless. Depending on your application, one of those other bands may be appropriate. Again, there's no blanket answer. There's no one do this or buy this one product. That's the one that's going to solve it for you. But depending on your application and consulting with knowledgeable people, we can help you get to what the right solution is for you so that you can still get wireless and be in good shape. And again, if you're eligible, get a license. So are we near the end here? Yeah, I think we're near the end. So at this point, I'm going to pass it back over to Kevin, see if maybe we got some questions or something I might be able to answer.
You bet, Gino. Thank you very much. I have seen several questions come in that you have addressed, and I suspect they're looking for just a little deeper information. So I'm going to just read a couple of these to you and see if you can fill in the gap here. There was a question about the databases, and they were wondering what some of the databases are to determine where frequencies are available. Now, they didn't indicate that this was post-auction, so if you could just talk a little over about the databases that are currently available from Shure.
Certainly. So, well, if you're talking about the official database providers, right, which are the companies that are authorized by the FCC to keep track of what spectrum is available, really what spectrum is available for the unlicensed white space devices, like that's kind of why those databases exist. In fact, let's see, do I still have control here? Because maybe I can just go back to that slide. I'm sorry, I'm going to go backwards in fast motion here to get back to that slide, so you can just see those web links. There's 4 database providers currently active, and that's Spectrum Bridge, KeyBridge, Google, and iConnective, or formerly Telcordia, right? So these are the database. These are the officially licensed by the FCC database providers. Now, again, I don't necessarily say these are the best places to go in order to determine what frequencies you should use for your wireless mics, because they tend to paint a pretty bleak picture. They include every TV channel, high power, low power, repeaters, everything. So a lot of times you go there, you enter your address, and it tells you nothing's available, when in all likelihood something probably is available. But this is where you would go to again figure out, if you're a licensed user and you want to register frequencies for your events, you would use one of these services to do that.
Okay, and we have several others here that have popped up. This one has to do with the licensing process, and well, not the process, but they're asking, will the license cover a company who operates in different states, or do they need to apply in each state? So this is a national license, right?
Not necessarily. It's a location-based thing. So that is, in other words, to qualify for a license, they want it to be someone who's using 50 or more channels of wireless at a time. right? So if you're using one in every 50 states, that's not quite the use case they had in mind, because you probably don't need to be reserving additional spectrum to get one wireless microphone working in a location. So that would be a bit of a hard sell. But something that you might be able to do is if it's a church that has multiple campuses that are within some, relatively close radius, maybe they're in the same town or something like that, but there's 3 different campuses. I think there have been a couple cases where you actually have been able to get a license, even though you don't use 50 wireless mics at any single one of those. If across the 3 campuses that are in relatively the same geographic area use a total of 50 or more, then that might qualify. Again, it's a gray area, but I would say if you're across different states, that's a little too spread out, unless you're using 50 or more at each location. But again, I think it's each kind of location or a user at that location is who has to get the license.
Very good. Excellent question. I'm glad that one was asked. Here's what I'll answer to get it out of the way real quick. They wanted to know if a copy of this webinar is available, and the answer is yes. We'll be sending that out to the people that registered, so that's a quick yes. The next question has to do with an integrator-specific question. How does an integrator use a license? Most installs use less than 50 channels, but the clients are important. We'd like to ensure that they are able to use the wireless mics that they bought. But as the integrator, they're not the user. What would be their best approach in that situation?
In that situation, you'd have to, the integrator could assist in helping the end user get a license. The integrator can't really be licensed in that because you're not ultimately the user. You're just selling it and you're putting it in, but you're not using it. You're kind of, ideally, you're kind of gone after that, right? So it wouldn't be any good for you to have a license. The people that are actually using it need to have a license. But the barrier still remains that if you install 10 wireless mics in a church, and that's all they have, they can't get a license. I mean, they're just not using enough of them to be able to qualify for that. But, if you're only using 10, you might not need a license because, if you put in 10 QLXD systems, you only need one open TV channel. The FCC has guaranteed there'll be at least one open TV channel, so you're probably fine anyway. Or maybe you're looking at a 900 megahertz system instead of, something in the TV band, so you don't have to worry about licensing either. So there's different approaches because, again, the licensed category is designed to protect the large-scale user, the users that have lots of channels on the air and will need to reserve these other TV channels or need these other protections simply because of the sheer number of wireless that they're trying to operate.
Another question, where can they go to get updates to this process? Obviously, it's an ongoing process. There's going to be changes. What's the best source of information to stay abreast of what's going on?
Well, of course, the FCC website, I mean, they're the ultimate authority. It's a little tricky sometimes to navigate around and find what you're looking for there, but you can't keep up with that. You can always do Google News alerts. Just put in an incentive auction for a Google alert and you'll get stuff. And go to our website. The Shure website, we do try to keep that information up to date. There are several blog articles and things like that on this topic that you can use to find that information.
This one is not so much spectrum related, but just an interesting question about wireless mic in general. Why do different manufacturers use different nomenclature for the frequency bands? So they mention what is called G50 for Shure as a different name by different manufacturers.
Because we can. Because there is no standard. I mean, I guess that would be nice, but all of the frequency bands that are out there that are being used are completely arbitrary, right? Depending on what an individual manufacturer wants to do, and different products have different tuning ranges, so that's not standardized. It's just I don't know. It's one of those things that there was never a standard developed, and it kind of ended up that way.
Then this one's kind of related to that. As we get past the auction and the repacking and all the new frequencies become defined, there are those pockets that you mentioned in the guard bands and other areas that will still be within the 600 megahertz range. Will those be assigned to frequency categories within the Shure nomenclature?
That, I think, is still to be determined how we want to utilize that spectrum. One of the things we're working with the FCC on, I think we can talk about this, is for Shure products that are firmware updatable, pushing out a firmware update that would limit that product's tuning range to only operate in those guard bands, right? Because that's all that would be legal. So that's a way to maybe keep some 600 megahertz equipment that's out there to still keep it running just via a simple firmware update. Will we produce new product that only operates in those bands? Too early to say. Maybe, maybe not, but I can't really comment too much one way or the other on that.
And here's a question that probably a lot of people will think, I don't know if they'll ask the question, but what are the consequences if they continue to use microphones within the forbidden 600 megahertz frequencies? Now they're saying after the roughly 39 months, but it's probably good to reiterate that the 39 months isn't guaranteed. It could actually be before that time.
Could be, yeah. Well, we answered this question a lot during the 700 megahertz transition as well. On a practical level, once these cellular data providers get up and running, it's probably going to be pretty hard to find clear frequencies to use. So you would notice a practical impact on the performance of your wireless mic system. So there's that. The second part of it, though, is like, well, let's say you were able to find a way to keep it working, should you? Well, technically it's illegal. So do you want to take that risk? I mean, I guess people do illegal things all the time at their own risk and hope that they don't get caught. So the same philosophy, I guess, could apply here. We certainly wouldn't condone that, nor would we recommend it. And the reason people do it is because there's the overriding philosophy is like, oh, the FCC is never going to catch me, or I'm too small, or how would they ever find out? And I mean, if you want to take that risk, that's up to you, I guess. But if you get caught using frequencies that is not legally able for you to, you could get fined, and the fines are quite steep. So to use 700 megahertz as an example, there were several high-profile places, I think like casinos and things like that, that were still using 700 megahertz wireless in spectrum that Verizon owned, and it wasn't the FCC running around with scanners looking for you, but Verizon was, and then Verizon will report you to the FCC, and we have seen these kind of nasty cease and desist letters from Verizon to these venues telling them, we know you're using 700 megahertz wireless, and you better stop, or we are going to report you to the FCC. So it'll likely be the same situation here. Whoever buys the spectrum is going to police it themselves, and they'll report you if they find you. So is it likely you're going to get caught? Who knows, but I would say let's try to play by the rules here, folks. The FCC is working with us to try and make sure we have spectrum that's usable, so let's be a good neighbor and do our part by playing by their rules as well.
And probably have time for one more here. This is an interesting question that has to do with speculation about will digital methods and techniques in wireless microphones likely allow them to be packed tighter together beyond what we're seeing currently? Or basically, how much more efficiency can we wring out of digital wireless microphones?
Well, we're going to try and get all we can, I think. I mean, again, we're to a point now that is, so far beyond where 15 years ago I would have ever thought we could have gotten with this technology. It's just unbelievable. Even in the ULXD, we've got something called a high density mode, which the trade-off is reduced range, but allows you to use 47 wireless mics in a single TV channel, which is just nuts. So can it get better? I expect that it can. How much? That's hard to say. I mean, physics is going to, rear its head here at some point and say that's as far as you can go, but I would expect to see continued improvements as well as continued investigation into other frequency bands where it makes sense and optimizing those bands too.
And this just came in, and this is a very meaty one here, real practical anyway. Is it possible to send in existing wireless units and have the frequencies updated? So the question is really about retuning radios. And basically, how would they find out if their radio is one that could be retuned?
Yeah, that's tricky because often it's not just a matter of I think the question probably comes from someone who remembers the old days of like crystal-controlled wireless systems that were fixed frequency. Imagine that. Sounds so arcane now, right? A wireless mic that you actually can't adjust the frequency on because it was a crystal. In those days, if you had one of those systems like a Shure LX wireless and it was on a particular channel that wasn't usable in your area, you could send it back to Shure. We'd put in a new crystal, just a couple of things, and you'd get it back on a new frequency, right? But with these frequency agile systems, to make it be in a different band than it's currently in basically requires replacing almost all the guts, right? You're putting new boards inside of the thing. So it's not necessarily as easy to just go ahead and swap that out, because it's practically getting a whole new product at that point. Now, I'll just go ahead and say it because I can't believe nobody even asked the question. So I'll just go there, which is the 700 during the 700 megahertz, we had a pretty generous rebate program, right? Where if you bought a new Shure wireless and turned in a 700 megahertz wireless, we'd cut you a check, right? And it was a pretty nice rebate there. So people keep asking, are we going to do the same thing here? And I'll just go out on record right now and say, I can't say anything yet because it's too early. But it's a true statement in that the auction isn't done yet. We don't know how much spectrum is actually going to be auctioned. So until we know that, we can't really say, well, here's our rebate and here's what we're going to do. So, we want to do everything we can to help our users out, and when the time comes and there's something to say, we'll say something about it. But that's probably a better or more likely path than just being able to return your old wireless and getting it somehow retuned to a new frequency.
It's a good answer for a very changing situation. As you say, it's all evolving. We're in the midst of this. We're certainly not at the point where we can blow the whistle and say, okay, here are the rules. Everybody has the game plan now. It's still being decided. Yep,
it's getting close. We're on stage 3, so we'll see how many more stages we have to go through.
Well, Gino, thank you very much. We had vigorous response from listeners, and they may yet come up with some questions. If they want to send them to me personally, I will forward them, or we'll get answers to them. My email is just Peckham, P-E-C-K-H-A-M, @FDW.com. And I'll make sure that Gino gets involved, and we'll track down answers for you. But the recording of today's webinar is available, and we will be sending that to everyone who registered for the webinar. And if there's any last-minute questions that come in, we will also deal with those. Beyond that, please don't forget to take the survey. You have been nice enough to join us for this. We'd like to do more of these in the future, and as a part of that, if you take the survey, that will help us to do a good job with those. And also, we're always interested in topics that would be useful to you. We thought this would be a good one. This is a meaty one, but there's other ones out there, and if you have other suggestions for webinars you'd like to hear about, please let us know. With that, Gino, thank you very much for joining us, and good luck to your baseball team.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Take care.
And that concludes our webinar. Thank you very much.